Hi everyone, I'm Gil Hernandez, the front-end design teacher here at Treehouse. In this Treehouse workshop, we'll cover some of the latest features in CSS, such as filter effects, the new calc function, flexbox, and multi-column layout, along with other exciting features in level 4 selectors and media queries that are still in the works, but we can look forward to using them in the near future. So let's get started. So first up, we'll go ahead and talk about CSS filter effects. Now, filters let us apply a variety of Photoshop-like effects to HTML content with simple CSS syntax. Now, with the filter property, we can create hardware-accelerated effects like blurs and drop shadows, and other effects like grayscale and contrast adjustments, all with a single line of CSS. So these are all from the W3C's Filter 1.0 spec, which is still an editor's draft, and things can change at any time. But I think it's at a stage where we can certainly experiment with these features and find creative ways to use them. Now, filters could be applied to pretty much any DOM element, such as images, text, even the video and canvas elements. Filters, what they do is, before our rendered page loads, the filter we use takes a snapshot of the page as a bitmap. Then based on the parameters we passed, a little pixel magic happens behind the scenes in the browser, and it applies the effect over the original page image before it's composited and rendered. So a good way to think of how filters work is sort of like a filter being placed on a camera lens. What we're seeing is being modified by the filter we used. And they're actually quite simple to use. So let's go ahead and go over how filter effects work. Currently, these filters are only implemented in WebKit-based browsers like Chrome and Safari. So for now, we'll have to use the WebKit vendor prefix. So first, let's take a look at the sepia filter. The sepia filter applies a sepia tone to the image, like we'd see in an antique photograph or an old Western movie. So let's take a look at what that filter would do to our image here. So first, we will specify the WebKit vendor prefix, followed by the filter property, and the sepia filter. Now, sepia accepts an argument in percentages, and a value of 100% makes our image completely sepia. So it now has that old-time feel. If we wanted to make our image black and white, we can use the grayscale filter. So we'll go ahead and change that to grayscale. Now, with grayscale, a value of 0% would leave the image unchanged, and a value of 100% makes our image completely grayscale. With the opacity filter, we can make our image semi-transparent. So let's go ahead and change this to opacity. Now, percentages are also accepted in the parameters here. A value of 100% is fully opaque, and the lower we go, the more transparent the image becomes. So let's take a look at what 50% looks like. And there we see that our image is semi-transparent. Some of this dark background is starting to show through. Other effects like blur lets us apply a Gaussian blur effect to the image. So we'll go ahead and change this from opacity to blur. Now, blur accepts an argument in pixels. So here I'm using a pixel parameter of 6 pixels, which affects how many pixels blend and get mixed into each other. The larger the pixel value, the more blur it creates. So there we see what a blur radius of 6 pixel looks like. Another really cool feature is hue rotate. Now, hue rotate adjusts the hues based on the hue angles in the color wheel and the input image's original colors. So it shifts every hue in the image around the color wheel by the degree parameters we provide. So let's take a look at that. We'll change it from blur to hue rotate. Now, hue rotate accepts parameters in degrees. So let's see what a hue rotation of 100 degrees looks like. So there we see our image there, and what actually happened is the filter rotated every hue in our image by 100 degrees. That's pretty cool. Now, my favorite filter effect is drop shadow. The syntax for drop shadow is just like the one we'd use for box shadow. So let's take a look at that. So just like box shadow, we'll first need to provide an X offset. So here I will make it 20 pixels. And we'll make the Y offset 20 pixels and also a blur radius of 20 pixels, followed by a drop shadow color. So when we refresh that, there we see the drop shadow at the edges of our image. The drop shadow filter is much more powerful than CSS box shadows, and it takes things a step further. So for example, we'll go ahead and make the pixel width a little larger here, and we'll change it from solid to dash, just so we can see this better. And when we refresh, notice how the filter-generated shadows follow the dashes in our image. Now that's really neat. But that's not all it does. Take a look at what it does with transparent background areas in an image. So here we'll use a transparent PNG of Mike the Frog. So I've removed the background here in Photoshop. Now in our markup, I'll go ahead and change the image to Mike.png. Then I'll remove the borders here just so we can see this a little better. So whereas box shadow would cast a shadow off the edges of the image, the drop shadow filter follows the transparent areas of the image. That's really neat. You can check out the rest of the filters in the W3C spec. As you can see, they are currently supported in WebKit-based browsers like Chrome, Safari, and iOS Safari. Some of the browsers are beginning to implement these effects in the hardware. So by being GPU accelerated, performance will be greatly improved for some of the slower effects like blur and drop shadow. So next up, we have the calc function. The new calc CSS method allows us to calculate values for length units with mathematical expressions. So calc can be used anywhere a length unit such as a pixel, em, or percentage is required. And with these expressions, we can specify sizes for HTML elements using a mixture of sizing units. So let's go ahead and take a look at how calc works. The calc property can be used anywhere there's a CSS length or number in our style sheet. When we use calc, the browser works out all the math and outputs the correct sizes for us. So for example, in our markup here, I have a div element with the class wrapper that has been styled to take up the entire height and width of the viewport, as we can see here. It has a blue background color applied. So in our CSS, let's go ahead and add the width property, and then we'll follow it with the WebKit vendor prefix and the calc expression. So in our expression, we can, for example, use a percentage, then use an operator like the minus symbol to subtract. So we'll use 50% minus 120 pixels. So we'll refresh this and we'll see that the right edge of our div here will always be 120 pixels to the left of the middle of our containing area. So let's go ahead and do another example with the height property. So we'll once again use the WebKit vendor prefix followed by the calc expression. So this time we'll use 80% for our width here. Then we will subtract it by 100 pixels. So now we can see that the bottom edge of our div here will always be 100 pixels above 80% of the containing height. So in our CSS, let's go ahead and change our width expression once again. So let's use, for example, 100%. Then we will divide it by 3 and use addition, and we will add 2 ems. So we'll refresh that, and we'll see that since we used division, it divided our width by 3, then added the extra 2 ems, which are relative to the base font size. So we can also use the asterisk for multiplication in our expression. So it does allow for all sorts of possibilities. Being able to compare values this way allows us to handle layout with far greater control than ever before with CSS. Once it's fully supported, calc will be a valuable CSS feature. The great thing is how it lets us mix percentages and absolute values, as well as mixing mixed sizing units to make layouts more flexible. So it's very similar to what math functions and preprocessors like less or SAS do. It makes those tedious calculations and conversions for us. Now, currently, the browser support for Calc is quite good. As you can see here, IE 10 will support it. Firefox, Chrome, Safari, and iOS Safari, however, do need the WebKit vendor prefixes. Modernizer at modernizer.com has added detection for it in their latest release, so you can actually test for it and provide a fallback solution if it's not supported. Next up, we have the flexible layout or Flexbox feature. So CSS hasn't exactly been a great language for handling layout, right? For example, floats have been a common layout method, but that kind of complicates the box model because it takes elements out of the normal document flow, and we have to worry about things like clear fixes or vertical alignment issues. So the new Flexbox feature is a powerful primitive that will make CSS much more efficient for layout and will solve many of these layout issues for us. So currently, Safari, Firefox, and IE 10 support the previous version of the Flexbox spec, which has a different syntax and it's a sort of slow and buggy implementation. The only browsers that do support the latest spec and syntax are Chrome and Opera, but soon we should see that the latest version of Flexbox should be supported in all modern browsers unprefixed. So let's go ahead and take a look at how Flexbox works.
So Flexbox handles one-dimensional CSS layout really well because we can lay out elements in pretty much any direction, up, down, left, or right, even place them out of order. We can also make boxes grow, shrink, and autofill space. So anything that involves putting boxes in a line, Flexbox can do it really well. So here we have a simple unordered list containing 4 list items. And we can see how it's looking in the browser. They're laid out in a column by default, and I've added some quick and simple styles just to get us started here in our example. So in order for us to use Flexbox, we'll need to establish a flex formatting context in our page. And we'll go ahead and do that for the unordered list, since it's the parent element of the list items we'll be laying out with Flexbox. So in our style sheet, we'll go ahead and add the display property in our unordered list rule. And since we're using Chrome, we'll start with the WebKit vendor prefix, followed by flex. Now, the flex value makes our unordered list a flex container box. So the content or children of the UL instantly become flex items. So now we see our list items are laid out as flex items in one row. But if we wanted them to remain as one column, well, we can use the flex flow property to do that, followed by the column value. And as you can see, they're back to being in a column. But there's a lot more we can do now than we could before we added that flex context. For example, I'll go ahead and add reverse. And we can see the order of the list items is reversed. So that's pretty neat. But we'll go ahead and go back to row so we can see the real power behind Flexbox. So for example, let's go ahead and see what WebKit justify content does. And let's use the value space between. So as we can see, this moves the first list item to the left and the last one to the right. Then it divides up the space in between. So this might come in handy when styling a navigation that you might want to take up an entire line with the links evenly distributed. So another property we could use is flex grow, which determines how much the flex item will grow relative to the rest of the flex items in the container. So let's go ahead and try that for our list item here. So if I set the flex grow to 1, we can see how our list item widths are evenly distributed. But let's go ahead and select 1 and have it grow just so we can see what happens when we do that. So here we're taking the third list item and the unordered list, and we're adding a flex grow of 5. So now we can see how the third one grows, and the space is evenly distributed between the first, second, and fourth. Now, if we wanted to change the order of these items, then we can use the order property. For example, a value of -1 will move the third item all the way to the beginning of the list. With Flexbox, it's easier than ever to vertically align boxes. Normally, we'd use margins, padding, line heights, or display elements as table cell in order to achieve the perfect vertical alignment. But with Flexbox, all we have to do is use the align self property. So for example, I'll go ahead and first set the height to 75 pixels just so we can see how this works. Then I will set a height of 300 pixels to the other list items just to set them apart. Now, align self accepts a few values, but we'll go ahead and use center. And now we can see how it's perfectly vertically aligned in our document here. Now, another value, for example, we can use flex end, and that will align it to the bottom. In our HTML, if we go ahead and add more list items, now we can see how the space is still evenly distributed inside the unordered list. They are, however, not wrapping within the flex container, as we can see here. The list items are overflowing. Well, we can easily take care of that with the flex wrap property. So in our unordered list here, we'll go ahead and use WebKit flex wrap with the value wrap. So now we can see how this creates a multi-line container. And now the items are stacked inside the flex container. Once it's broken into lines, each line is then laid out independently.
Even though we still need the vendor prefixes, the Flexbox spec has stabilized and it's currently in the W3C's candidate recommendation stage. So soon it will be released as a final web standard. We can start using it now, but you might want to delay a little because you want to delay using it at least until Firefox and WebKit release it on prefix, which should be by the end of 2012 or the beginning of 2013. So by understanding how Flexbox works now, we can start thinking of ways to completely implement it into our layouts in the near future. Another new layout feature is multi-column layout. Multi-column layout resembles Flexbox in that it gives us a lot of layout flexibility, but the difference is that it's designed for text layout, for creating multiple text columns. And it doesn't actually create a new section or an entirely new box in the document. It just extends the block layout mode by flowing a box's content into multiple columns within the same box. We're also able to determine the column widths, gaps, and rules, and much more, all with simple CSS properties. So let's go ahead and check it out.
Multi-column layout introduces a new type of column box container where the content is flowed into multiple column boxes. So in our markup, we have a div containing a lot of text. So let's go ahead and divide this text into multiple columns. And the div will act as our container for a multi-column layout. In our CSS, let's start with the column count property, which lets us set the number of columns. So we'll use the WebKit vendor prefix since I'm using Chrome, followed by column count. And I'll go ahead and specify a column count of 4. So now, no matter how wide or narrow our screen is, the content will always be split into 4 columns. We can set gaps in between our columns with the column gap property. So in our CSS, once again, WebKit prefix, followed by column gap. So let's go ahead and make our gap 3ems. When we refresh the page, we can see that all columns have these equal gaps in between of 3em. We can also add a column rule in between our columns with the column rule property. So once again, in our div rule here, we'll specify the column rule property. And this is kind of like our border property. So here we'll do the column width, followed by the style, which will be dotted, and we'll make it black. Actually, we can just remove the black because that is inherited. So we'll refresh the page, and now we can see how the column rule appears in the middle of our column gaps. Now, if we need our columns to be a specified width, we can use the column width property to do that. So let's go ahead and set the column width to 250 pixels. We'll refresh that. So now our columns will always be 250 pixels wide. So this is sort of like a max width for our columns, because as you can see, when the browser window or screen size is narrow, the column count is reduced to fit the screen by flowing its content into less columns. But they're still 250 pixels wide. So this is really great for responsive web design. Another property we can use is column span. Column span makes it possible for an element to span across several columns. So for example, in our HTML here, I'll go ahead and just add an H2 somewhere in the middle. We can refresh that and we can see that it's somewhere in between the middle column here. Now back in our CSS, we'll go ahead and create a new rule for the heading 2. And we will use the WebKit column span. Now the value all, as we can see, the H2 spans across all of our columns. So the element establishes a new block formatting context. So as we just learned, multi-column layout allows us to achieve scalable layouts that fit all types of screen sizes.
The multi-column layout module has been a candidate recommendation since April 2011. So hopefully soon it will be recommended as a web standard and we can begin using it unprefixed in all browsers. IE 10 will support it unprefixed, but we still need to include the Moz and WebKit prefixes if we were to use it right now. So before we get into the new level 4 features, we need to clear up a misconception there is about CSS 4. So in his recent article, Tab Atkins, who works on the Google Chrome team, he's a member of the CSS working group, and he writes some of the specs that we've been discussing here, like Flexbox. So Tab emphatically states there is no such thing as CSS 4. And to summarize his article, Tab mentions that the CSS working group realized that these big monolithic versions of CSS weren't any good because they were too difficult to maintain and develop. So instead, they decided to split up CSS into individual modules that can level up independently. That way, some features won't slow down other features from being implemented when they're ready for recommendation. Now, because of that, some modules start out as level 3 only if they extend something from CSS 2.1. And the same goes for level 4. So Flexbox, for example, is an entirely new feature, so it actually starts at level 1. The main thing he wanted to point out in his article is that the level a CSS module is at has no correlation with what version of CSS it's in. So it's all CSS or CSS3 regardless of the level, because from now on, CSS will no longer be versioned as a whole. So we can just drop the version number entirely and just refer to it as CSS. So let's quickly go over some of the level 4 features that are still in the works and what we can expect to be using hopefully in the near future. So first, we'll take a look at the level 4 selectors. There's a new set of pseudoclasses called location pseudoclasses. And the one I wanted to take a look at in particular is the local link pseudoclass. So local link will be a useful selector for, say, styling the navigation of the link of the current page. Normally, we'd have to maybe use a separate CSS class like current or active and apply it to the current page item in the nav through maybe PHP or manually adding it to the markup. So with local link, we'll be able to target all links on the page that link to the current page. So here, for example, if we wanted to remove the underlined text decoration from the current page link in the nav, we'd just select our nav, then follow it with the local link pseudo class, and that's it. Another neat thing in the works is a selector that determines the subject of a selector. Now, some might refer to it as a parent selector because it would allow us to target the parent element of a particular child. So this is still a work in progress. As we can see here, they're still sort of ironing out some of the syntax, but we'll go ahead and take a look at an example anyways. So in this version of the spec, if an exclamation is prepended to the selector, it will select any ordered list when it has a list item as the only child. So we'll only select it if it has that only child list element. You might have seen other versions of the spec where a $ is being used instead of an exclamation mark. Well, like I said, this is all still very new, but ultimately it should achieve what we see in this example. All right, next up, the new media queries proposals are in, and they are primarily aimed at giving us more precise targeting, making design responsive to input types, and making our content more accessible for users who don't have certain scripts enabled, like JavaScript. So let's go ahead and take a look at a few of the new media features. So first up, the script media feature will query if JavaScript is supported and if it's enabled in the browser. So this will hopefully give us an easier way of creating fallback CSS when JavaScript is disabled in a browser. Another feature is the pointer media feature. Now, this will query the presence and accuracy of a pointing device. So this is the one I'm really excited about because we can use this proposed coarse and fine properties here. We can use these coarse and fine values to tell the user agents to check if an accurate pointing device is being used, like a mouse, for example, or if a pointing system with limited accuracy, like a finger, is the primary pointing device. Now, the hover media feature will detect if the primary pointing system can create a hover state, like a mouse in a browser, for example, or if it's a touchscreen where you cannot hover with touched input. So if you do a lot of front-end web development, there are some browsers and builds you can download to test some of the very latest features out there before they're implemented into the stable version of browsers. I encourage you to check some of these out. This way you can be at the bleeding edge of web development. So let's take a look at some of them. So first we have Chrome Canary, which you can download as a separate browser to test all of the latest features before they are released in Chrome stable. Now, Canary runs side by side with your Chrome install, and a new build is available almost daily. Safari's WebKit Nightly build lets you test the latest official version of Safari's WebKit rendering engine. It's also updated daily, and it doesn't change your current installment of Safari. Once you install it and launch it, it injects the latest, faster, and more advanced versions of the WebKit render engine right into your Safari browser. So you can check that out at nightly.webkit.org. Similar to the WebKit Nightly build, Mozilla has Firefox Nightly, also for testing purposes, and you can check that out at nightly.mozilla.org. Now finally, caniuse.com is a great source that gives us comprehensive compatibility tables for browser support of all the latest CSS and HTML5 features. So be sure to check this site frequently for all the latest in desktop and mobile browser support. So that'll do it for this CSS workshop. I encourage each of you to be forward thinkers by experimenting and having fun with these new features we can use today, like filter effects, Flexbox, and multi-column layouts. Just because they're not widely supported just yet doesn't mean we can't find creative ways to use them. And if you come up with something awesome, don't forget to share it with us here at Treehouse. Thanks, everyone.